Hi, I'm Emily and I work in the communications team at Beaver Trust. You may have seen the Environment Agency report published back in March about how 5 years of beaver activity reduced the impact of flooding. Now, that research took place at Spainswell Estate in Essex, and it showed a reduced risk of flooding to the downstream community of Finchingfield. I visited Spainswell earlier this year to chat with Archie Ruggles-Bryce about how the beavers have been getting on, how they're protecting valuable trees like cricketbat willow from beaver foraging, and also how they're scaling up their beaver operations.
So the reason we've got beavers on this estate in lowland Essex is because we were trying to reduce flood risk to our local village of Finchingfield. A small number of houses at risk, nothing big enough to attract central funding, so an ideal location to look at natural flood management. And in 2018 we proposed doing natural flood management with a series of man-made timber leaky dams, but also bringing a pair of beavers in as a comparison really to try and work out whether there was a role for them to play in natural flood management in this area. So we've got 3 enclosures on the estate now. We've got about 15 enclosed beavers, and they're really, for us, they're a tool. So they're not the reason we're here. We're not trying to rewild per se. We are certainly allowing beavers to have their space, but within fenced enclosures. They are, instead of diggers and diesel for us, they are really just saving us a lot of time and effort, and actually creating a much better outcome than we could ever have done by ourselves by hand. Where we're standing now, 5 years ago, was just a woodland, so a normal broadleaf woodland on a lowland farming estate. And so behind me you can now see one of the wetlands that the beavers have created. So we're up to about 10 large dams now in here, and we're storing over 2.5 million litres of water. Behind me you can see the lodge, which is where at least some of the beavers are living. And in front of the lodge, which they keep adding to, there is a food cache. So that means that during winter, if the pond around the beaver lodge was to freeze, then the beavers can easily access food throughout the year. So they can go underwater, they can feed underwater, and not have to go too far from their lodge during the harsh times of year. But our beavers seem to be quite house proud, and they build more and more onto this lodge every year. So we're standing overlooking the 2nd and 3rd beaver enclosures that we put in, and this is us scaling up what we're doing with the nature-based solutions, using beavers again as a tool. So we've set aside a lot of our more sloping land that runs down to the river to try and reduce the amount of soil that we're losing and all the things that are bound to that soil. So we're improving the water quality, and then at the bottom of it, where the beavers are active, they're going to be creating a massive wetland that will extend about 2 kilometres up the river. So in 20-30 years time, this will look like it would have done in sort of Paleolithic times. So in this enclosure, the pair of beavers that we released in here were a pair when they came in, and they have been, as you can see, pretty effective at building dams. So we've already got, in less than a year, several dams in here, creating this big impoundment you can see behind us. So it's doing exactly what we hoped it would do. Interestingly, in our other enclosure, where the beavers were released at exactly the same time, they came in as not a pair, and they haven't really paired up, or we don't think they have. So we're not seeing any of these dams. So they're just living in burrows quite happily, but not creating the structures. So it's really interesting to see the difference between, 2 different pairs of beavers. You would kind of assume that they were all going to do the same thing, but they clearly haven't. So this is a cricketbat willow that the beavers have felled. We're quite happy for them to fell this one. It's not a great quality one. But one of the things we're trying to do here is trying to understand how do we protect these incredibly valuable trees from beavers. In some parts of East Anglia, they are pretty much the only trees that are growing around the banks of rivers. So if beavers were more widespread, then it would be a real question as to how do you protect them. So what we've done, we've tried a couple of ways of doing this. We've put wire netting around the trees, which does keep the beavers off. It's not the most attractive looking thing, but it's very effective. But what we've also done is painted some of our trees with a mixture of sand and adhesive. So as the tree grows, you can see that at the moment this has been freshly applied. The sand and adhesive mix is kind of pretty solid on there. As the tree grows, it basically just expands. and the sand mix expands with it, so leaves gaps, so it looks a little bit more like it is at the top here with more gappy areas, but we find that still the beavers are still put off by it. There's enough kind of grittiness there, particularly if they've got other stuff to go for. This has only been done relatively recently, within the last 6 months, but we have some trees that we painted over 5 years ago where the sand paint has stayed and the beavers still haven't eaten them. What's going to be interesting in the enclosure we're standing in at the moment is there are far fewer trees than our original enclosure, so we're really interested to see whether this is going to be enough to keep the beavers off these trees that we've selected. I think ourselves and our partners, the Environment Agency, the Rivers Trust and the Wildlife Trusts, have really become convinced that this is a really important and valuable way of trying to provide kind of low-level flood risk reduction in upland areas. So we're in the top of a river catchment in Essex, so that's an ideal place to be doing this kind of work. And aside from the flood risk benefits, what we're seeing is a huge amount of biodiversity coming back to this area. We've got water in a landscape that's otherwise dry, and we are cleaning and storing that water as well.